Hello. How's everybody doing? So I want to give a brief introduction. He kind of already talked a little bit about who I am. And I can tell you right now, sitting through the last 3 hours, I feel a mixture of my pregnancy hormones and emotions. And also this last week, I really feel like I've had a heart burning of intercession for this topic. And so I'm here ready to share with you guys some things that I've learned. I've worked in the mental health field for about 10 years. I've done in-home therapy, and I've also done outpatient therapy, and that's what I'm currently doing at Water's Edge. And so I have had kind of a broad range of working with different people who have been either exploited or sexually traumatized. When I first began the work, that's not necessarily what I was planning on doing. I just asked the Lord to kind of show me the people group and who He wanted me to work with, and I just felt like they just started coming to me. And so I feel like I've kind of fallen into this work as opposed to seeking it out. And so I have worked with mostly women who have been through different types of sexual trauma. I have worked with women who have been trafficked, who have been prostituted, and different at-risk youth, and I'm trying to think of what else. That's pretty much kind of covers a little bit of what I do. So one of the things that I want to do is I want to start out with what I call psychoeducation. So that's psychological education, just to kind of ground us in a little bit of what happens to the trauma person's brain and nervous system when they've been traumatized. And I'll only go over this for about 5 minutes because I know it can get a little, talking about the brain can get a little bit boring, but it's going to provide some context for what I'm going to be talking about in a little bit. So something that I typically do, I'm going to kind of walk you through a little bit of a process of what I do when I have a client who's been traumatized and they come into my office. And one of the things that I first provide for them is just that psychoeducation of, this is how your brain has been impacted by trauma, this is how your body has been impacted by trauma, and it really helps them normalize their symptoms that they've had, and it really grounds them, because I have a lot of clients who will say, gosh, I don't feel like I'm going crazy. This is actually a symptom or an outcome of what I've been through. And so in that way, it can just be really reassuring and validating for them. I am going to be using a flip chart today, but I'm unable to put it up on the slides because I just kind of bumped into some copyright issues. So the flip chart I'm using is by a woman. She's a trauma research person. Her name is Janina Fisher. And if you Google Janina Fisher and flip chart, that could be made available to you. It's even something that you can purchase online. She also has a really good article on dissociation, which is a very common symptom for those who have been traumatized. And it's a very important symptom for us to understand if you're working like on the front lines or if you're working with individuals. So I'll just go through a little bit of her flip chart again briefly, and then I'll kind of go into the rest of my talk. So when I have someone come in first, I walk through a little bit of like the signs or the symptoms of trauma and what they've been through. And so some of those things are depression, irritability. It's a lot of what Jessica went through on her slides. Decreased concentration, a loss of a sense of the future, hopelessness, emotional overwhelm, shame and worthlessness, little to no memories of the actual trauma itself, nightmares or flashbacks, constantly being hypervigilant. I kind of describe it as like eyes in the back of the head and mistrusting of every situation. Anxiety, people can have chronic pain in their bodies even, headaches, different things like that. Another thing that you'll see that's kind of a comorbid diagnosis or set of symptoms is people can have either eating disorders or substance use disorders, and that's kind of an important thing to know. I've worked with a lot of clients who have had substance use issues who haven't really had a strong addiction to alcohol or drugs, but they simply use it to stabilize and regulate the roller coaster of emotions that they experience. So it kind of provides like that temporary Band-Aid of helping them stay regulated in their body. Feeling unreal or out of body, that's the dissociation. Self-destructive behavior, and a loss of sense of who I am. And that's a big one, a loss of sense of who I am as a person, what is my identity, and that can be a big thing that people come in with. So I actually feel compelled. I don't know if any of you are familiar that sometimes God can speak to us through dreams. At least that's kind of what he does for me. And one of the dreams I had about a woman who was being sold into trafficking is she was running away from this faceless person. And as she was running away, this faceless person kept on ripping off one item of clothing, another item of clothing. So he was literally stripping her of her identity so that she had no other place to go, so that she was pretty much naked and vulnerable to whatever might come. And so that kind of provides a good picture for what she might go through. Okay, so a little bit more about the brain. So we have one mind and we have 3 different brains within our one mind, and I'm gonna use my hands for this one. And so we have our front brain, that's our frontal lobe, and that is the part of the brain that is responsible for thinking reasonably, rationally. This is the part of the brain that isn't developed till the age of 25. And so when you're thinking about at-risk youth, the parent actually has to be the child or teenager's prefrontal cortex. They have to be their thinking, reasoning, logical part of the brain. So that's where really healthy boundaries and different things comes into play. And then you have what's called the limbic system. That's kind of the middle part of the brain. And in that part of the brain is the emotional memory center. It's the amygdala. And that is kind of where like the gut memories are stored. And then the last part of the brain is the brain stem. That's the back brain. And it's connected to our spinal cord and our nervous system. And that's the part of the brain that is responsible for increased heart rate, breathing. It's when the body either speeds up or it kind of shuts down. So that's kind of how they're all connected. So in trauma situations, let's say a person has been chronically traumatized. The frontal lobes actually begin to go offline, which means that they cannot think or reason for themselves, especially as kind of John talked about, they're getting groomed more, they're getting kind of psychologically manipulated, they have a harder time being able to think for themselves. And then when I'm working with a client, let's say that kind of aftercare part when they've been through the trauma, a lot of times they are living their lives out of that chronically traumatized state. So they're living through that, like, there's always an alarm, there's always something wrong, and they're kind of living out of that place of trauma brain. That's kind of what you hear about, like, the fight, flight, freeze, submit trauma responses, because that's kind of how their brain, in a sense, has been conditioned, and that's kind of the response to trauma. And then the brainstem, again, is that place where once the midbrain kind of sounds the alarm, the brainstem, that's when it responds to, either running away or fighting, or sometimes a person can only freeze or submit in a situation. So that'll be what I talk about for the brain, and then I'll kind of move on to some different parts. So one of the things I want to talk about too is dissociation, and this kind of builds off of what I talked about. So dissociation is a process that happens to a person who's traumatized where their actually mind and their body separate. And because a person, whether it be a child, a teenager, or an adult, when they're being put through a trauma situation, their brain doesn't have the ability to kind of integrate the experience. And so it's compartmentalized into a very isolated trauma experience, and that's where people may not even have a recall of that particular memory. And I don't know if any of you guys have watched Nefarious. I'm assuming a bunch of you guys probably have. But what you'll notice in that documentary is that the women will be talking about how they actually had different parts called forward when they had to be traumatized. And so a lot of times I've worked with clients who have had different parts that have been used for kind of the trafficking or the traumatization, because that's really the only way that they know how to survive. So we view dissociation very much as a survival tool, and it's something that actually helped them cope and get through. So one of the perpetrator's jobs is to groom the person being trafficked, and a part of that grooming process is to actually encourage dissociation and fragmentation in the traumatized individual. This removes the traumatized individual's ability to think rationally and use their prefrontal cortex, their reasoning, thinking mind, and their will. And the more exposure a person has to trauma, the more the brain is physiologically numbed and in a constant state of survival. So I'll kind of break that down a little bit. So one of the, I feel like John covered this really well, there's kind of a breaking down of a person's will and of their ability to think and rationalize for themselves. So when I work with someone who's been really traumatized, it's like the traumatized part is out forward more than their actual authentic self that they were created and born to be. And so part of treating trauma is to be able to get their authentic voice and their selves kind of fully more whole and more forward, because they're very disintegrated, right? They've got the trauma part of self, their authentic self. And I've worked in different situations. I've worked with people who've come out of, let's say even as heavy duty as something like the occult, where they have been literally programmed and trained to have those different sides of self kind of out during the trauma. So the more chronic the trauma, the more the will weaken and the authentic personality and the voice of a person becomes suppressed. And then again, their primary focus is survival. So if you think about, if you're in kind of a chronically traumatized situation, you're just going to be focusing on surviving and getting through the day. And so when I work with people who've kind of come out of it, a lot of times that's their only way of thinking is, I just need to survive the day, I need to survive the moment. And they're not thinking beyond the day. They're just thinking, I need to get through this day. So their ability to be able to think about their future and have any sense of hope and purpose, that's kind of been crushed or diminished. And this kind of expounds on kind of what I've already talked about. In a sense, the perpetrator takes control of the rights of the person, and they become now their prefrontal cortex. They become their ultimate authority figure. And so again, part of that treatment is strengthening their true identity and helping them regain their will and redeveloping their brain. And there's been a lot of research that's come out that is the hopeful part of the trauma interventions and kind of what we're learning more and more about trauma is that a person's brain can actually change, and there's a little bit more plasticity to the brain. So maybe in the 70s or 80s, we really thought, the brain can't change. Once a person's been traumatized, especially as a child, they can't grow and their brain can't change. And we're really finding that not to be true. And that more and more, even in my own work, I've been realizing that the brain actually really does change. And I think part of that is the healing that's found in Jesus, and I'll bring that in towards the end as well. So I'll just touch on this really briefly, but trauma also impacts relationships and attachment styles. Dan Allender has some good resources on this. He came out with a book a long time ago called The Wounded Heart, and he has more fresh resources now. But he talks about, how each person the different attachment or relational styles of each woman who might come out of the trauma. And it could be like the party girl, he calls the tough girl, and the nice girl. And these are very much generalities. And there's different strategies that people use to be able to relate and attach to other people. And so one of the things, even when I'm doing therapy, I'm working on with women or teenagers is to really help them redevelop that sense of attachment. Because again, if you're thinking about the way that they've been treated, the way that they've understood love, all of those things, it's really weird for them to actually have someone who actually cares about them and who is a safe person. And so that might even be something that you recognize, whether you work in some sort of shelter or stabilization, or you work with people who've been through trauma, that oftentimes it's the relationship itself that's really healing. And in therapy, they say 40% of a person's progress is because of the therapeutic relationship. But I think that could kind of be anyone who knows how to healthfully attach to a person who's been traumatized. So, the other thing, I'm just kind of going through all of the different things and then I'll kind of wrap this up a little bit. There's three different phases to trauma treatment. So I wanted to bring this in because depending on where you feel called or what you want to do, this would be kind of a healthy or a really good way to conceptualize, where is a person at with their trauma. So being where I work at a place where I'm working with people who've already come out of trauma, whether it's someone who's come out of prostitution, someone who's come out of, the occult, someone who's come out of, even sexual abuse from childhood, all of that. So I'm working kind of more on that spectrum or that side of things. So phase one of the three phases is stabilization. And when you think of crisis centers, shelters, all of those places, that is really where you're getting a person stabilized. And you might have some people who pop in and out of there, and they kind of know that, okay, this is a safe place I can go. I, might get back into the life, and then I'll go. And then in this phase, really what's needing to happen is a person's basic needs are just needing to be met. And so when a person is freshly out of trauma or trafficking, their housing needs to get met, food, shelter, and just a sense of safety. They might not feel safe because their trauma is so activated, but as long as they kind of that safety net is kind of provided. And so that's really kind of the first step when someone walks out of trauma. That's kind of the focus that should be happening. And then and also with phase one, I'll say this, is helping a person not live in trauma response. So sometimes when I get someone who's constantly having flashbacks and their life's being ruled by their trauma brain or trauma symptoms, we'll really be working on like everyday skills and all that sort of stuff. And then phase two is reprocessing or memory work. I am specifically trained in an approach called EMDR and then also sensory motor psychotherapy. And these are a little bit different than talk therapy because they're called bottom-up approaches, which means, a person can go to therapy and talk, but they're just using their cognitive, whereas trauma impacts the whole body. And so there's some different therapy approaches that they've come out maybe in the 80s or 90s, but they're really getting mastered and the field's really learning and understanding more about their effectiveness. And so there's a couple of different approaches that can really help a person process through their trauma. And again, they're not going to be able to do that unless the phase one is kind of, unless their basic needs and all of those things are getting met. And then another part that you can use in phase two treatment is more of like the inner healing approaches. And that would be, you could go on, there's so many different ones out there, like, a manual approach or Sozo. I've even used, like Theophostics. There's all sorts of different things. I wouldn't say there's like a one size fits all, but, there's different things that you can use to also treat trauma. And then phase three is the integration phase. And this is the phase where people begin to form their identity outside of trauma. Because when someone first comes in, it's like, as a traumatized person, that's kind of all encompassing, that's all that they know. And so I'm really helping them also step out of that place and be like, well, who are you outside of the trauma, outside of what you've been through? And in phase three, it doesn't mean that they don't have any trauma triggers or memories or different things that don't come up. It just means that they are able to recognize it more quickly and use their skills and all of that sort of stuff. So I thought I would provide that framework because depending on where each of you feel called, I think it's just really important to kind of have an understanding around, okay, if I'm working with a traumatized person, how would I go about helping them? And not everyone's called to be a therapist, or have the extensive amount of training that I have in trauma, but I think if you could at least have a trauma lens to some degree, I would highly encourage it. I can't tell you how many clients have actually had come to me and have been, they've been going to church and they've been getting prayer for their trauma symptoms, and things just don't seem to be getting better, and they feel a lot of condemnation from people at church because they feel like they should just be fixed. And when you understand trauma, you understand that it's a process and it takes time. So it's really important, I think, that as we enter into this world of sex trafficking, we really have that trauma lens. I've also worked with people who have been kind of on the front lines of sex trafficking, whether that be in different countries, and they also need that trauma lens because there's a lot of different things that they can be exposed to themselves, a lot of secondary trauma, so also be aware of that. And I'll go into some of that in a little bit too, of just some things to kind of take away. This is also something I will mention, is because I've worked at 2 agencies that have been, I worked at an agency that was Christ-centered, Christian-focused, and the agency I work at now, we very much support Christian integration into therapy, is I have bumped up against a lot of people who have been groomed and abused in the church. And when I did my presentation before, I had said that probably about 60 to 70% of the people that I've worked with have been in the church. And whether that be, it wouldn't matter what denomination, it doesn't really matter. But like John was kind of talking about, like the wolf in the sheep's clothing type of thing, that can be very much a reality. And it's not necessarily to make us jaded about all churches, because there's a lot of churches where that doesn't happen. But there are churches where they're using the institution to kind of get in and have their agenda. So it's something to be aware of. So one of my heart just desires is to bridge the gap between the mental health world and the church. And again, like there's kind of 2 extremes that we've kind of had with the mental health world and the church. Like on one hand, the mental health world, like if someone just treats the soul, the mind, will, and the emotions, and they just deal with like the psychological health of a person, that's not the full picture. We need both the spiritual and the psychological. So a person could be going to therapy for years, and maybe they're not getting the real healing that they need or getting a whole lot better. And then you have the church, and sometimes they can get a little bit extreme in thinking, okay, well, if we just pray for this person, they should get better and get them out the door. So there needs to be that blend. And actually, where I work, Water's Edge Counseling and Healing Center, we have a bridging foundation where it's our heart's desire to bridge the gap between the mental health world and the church. So we will go into different churches or places and bring awareness around trauma. And so that's something that we do. So I want to mention 3 things about who Jesus is in the healing process for those who have been traumatized and victimized. The first thing that I've learned is that he is both loving and powerful. And he's kind of like the lion and the lamb, right? Like he's the soft place to land for people, and he's also their defender and their fighter. And he is powerful enough to be able to heal. And I've seen that play out very much in the therapy setting. The second thing is that Jesus is always with the person. I've had a lot of people when we've maybe dove into memory work, or if I'll talk to other people about who Jesus is in the healing process, they'll say, well, he couldn't have been in the brothel. He couldn't have been in the dark, dark, dark place. And always, he's there. And whenever I've had a client do any type of memory work or be in the dark places, they always know that he's there. And that might bring up a whole nother set of questions for those who've been traumatized, right? Like, why didn't you do anything about it? But that can be a very healing part of therapy and for people who need like the spiritual healing. And then the other thing about who Jesus is he mends the broken pieces and he puts them back together. And in the verse, probably my life chapter, Isaiah 61, it talks about how he's sent to bind up the brokenhearted and to set the captives free. And brokenhearted, the Greek word or the Hebrew word is shabar, and shabar means shattered minds and hearts. And so when you think about dissociation, the shattered minds and hearts is the fragmentation. And I can tell you, I have had so many clients find healing and become whole and integrated, especially when Jesus is involved. I've had clients who have had 40 different personalities become one. And that takes time, but I'm here to tell you that like it's very real. And I feel like as we kind of walk into the fullness of who, especially for me, who he's called me to be, I want to carry that healing power and bring it to people, that it's not just something that he'll put a Band-Aid on. He wants to heal the whole person. So I want to end with this. As I was in prayer last week preparing for this, I felt like the Lord spoke to me and he said, I want you to teach my people how to heal or how to love the broken ones. And then there were 5 things that I was kind of given. And the first one is compassion. And in Mark 6:34, Jesus saw the crowd and he felt compassion for them. And when you look up this word compassion, it means loving someone from your inward parts and being moved towards action. And so compassion is a very action-oriented word. I used to feel compassion in probably maybe a more unhealthy way. It was like, oh, I've got this burden and I need to fix them or I need to save them. It's like, no, that's not compassion. It's doing what you're called to do and being effective in using your gifts. And so it shouldn't be this big burden we feel. When I feel compassion, I feel it kind of like a burning in my heart. And so there's kind of a difference there. And I will also say along the lines of compassion is loving the traumatized individual through their brokenness and their symptoms. Because sometimes when I work with a traumatized person, their symptoms can be like, oh, sometimes it makes you not totally love them. Or sometimes they're making a lot of interesting choices in their life, or they're, using substances or different things. But if you see it through that lens of compassion and love, you're able to help, you can understand more of where they're coming from as opposed to kind of coming from that place of judgment. So that's something that I always kind of keep in the back of my mind when I'm working with people. And I've mentioned this one already. The second one is having a trauma lens or understanding. And it is important to have some form of understanding. Again, like you don't have to have the full training, but if you even just have some idea of kind of how trauma impacts the brain nervous system, I think you'd be really good to go. And there can be different books out there, or even listening to, a lot of ways I learned is listening to people's experiences and asking them questions and how the trauma impacted them personally. And number 3 is healing is a process. In the New Testament, there are 3 forms of healing. And the 3 are, the first one is sozo, which is restoring and healing the whole person, body, soul, and spirit. The second form of healing is, I'm going to see if I can pronounce this, IMI, which is the instantaneous miraculous healing, and those were often the healings that Jesus did. And then the third type of healing is therapia. And the therapia, which I love that type of healing because that's what I do, it's the process of healing. And I think that gives us some good context in the church around when we're walking alongside individuals who've been traumatized or who are coming out of certain types of lifestyles, that it's really going to be a process that we're bringing them through, as opposed to like the instantaneous type of healing. Now, don't get me wrong, I fully believe, my husband just got back from a missions trip in Mexico, and he saw a lot of instantaneous healings. And so I'm kind of asking the Lord, like, what does that look like in treating trauma? Because I would love to see more of that happen in my therapy office. So don't get me wrong, I'm pressing in for that. And I almost think that if a client got healed, or a person, let's say you pull them out of a trafficking situation and they've been chronically traumatized for, let's say, 5 years, if they got healed overnight, it would almost be too much for them to handle. And so if you kind of think about like, you know, the person's capacity to be able to tolerate freedom, the fact that it is a process is almost more gentle than having it be like, okay, an overnight process. But what I typically see in client sessions is that there can be more really quick turnaround moments that I'm like, that should have taken 6 months to get that done, where it's not taking as long. And so that's just kind of something to bear in mind, that to know that, you know, there's different types of healing that can happen for those who've been traumatized. And I just have a few minutes left, so this is the last part I'm going to cover. This is a lesson I wish I would have known in the beginning as a therapist when I was working with people who'd been trafficked or traumatized, is that it's not my job to fix them. And I think when we hear all of this information, we want to like run and fix, and you know, there's a really strong impulse that can go with that. And I do believe that we're called towards action, but there's that fine line of I'm walking alongside someone and I'm empowering them. I'm not necessarily fixing them or enabling them. And I've gotten even several dreams about this with different clients, where it's like at first you're giving them milk, and then you're breaking up the food and you're giving them food, you know, pureed food, and then you're helping them walk, you know, so you're bringing them through these different stages of development and attachment. And so the more they kind of grow up, the more you can kind of empower them more and more. So that's kind of something I have always held in my mind. And then lastly, caring for yourself as the agent of healing. So if any of you are going to be going into the more of the frontline work or have gone overseas, be aware that something that can happen is secondary trauma, and that's something that we're always aware of as therapists at Water's Edge, that we can, because we're being exposed to so many stories and symptoms, that secondary trauma is basically like, there's similar symptoms to PTSD. And another thing that can happen is compassion fatigue, where you become so hyper compassionate that that muscle gets kind of shut down, because as human beings we can only exercise so much compassion. And so that's where you know, get to find your balance in that, as far as taking care of self, doing things that you enjoy. And there's a whole slew of self-care things that people can do, whether you're in the frontline work or you're really kind of delving into the sex trafficking world, to be able to do that. So that is all that I have. So there you go.